All right, what's going on, everybody? I hope you're doing good. Now, last week, if you will remember, we covered the book of Acts. Now, the first part of the book of Acts, I'm sure you know, covered mostly Peter and some of the other apostles and their role in the spread of Christianity throughout the region of Judea and some of the surrounding areas. Now, the second part of the book of Acts focuses mostly on a man named Paul, who wasn't even a part of the original 12 disciples or apostles. And he started out as Saul, so I'll probably refer to him as Paul from here on out. But as we move into this section of the New Testament, we need to understand that nearly 2/3 of the New Testament was written by this man, the Apostle Paul. And so it's important that we get a little bit of background, a little bit of understanding about who this man was, what his motivations were, what his heart was for the church and the spread of the gospel. Now, that being said, let's just do a little bit of historical work here with him. First of all, let's remember that Paul was a Pharisee. He actually started out as probably one of the most vehement opponents of the Christian faith. Now, Pharisees saw themselves kind of as guardians of the Jewish faith, and this new sect of Judaism, which proclaimed that Jesus was indeed the promised Messiah from the Old Testament, was seen definitely as heretical. And Paul was going to do everything in his power, or Saul at the time, was going to do everything in his power to stamp out this new sect of Judaism. In fact, he would have people arrested, he would have them beaten, and even murdered. He stands by, I think in Acts chapter 7, while a young deacon by the name of Stephen, proclaiming the name of Jesus Christ and defending the church, is stoned to death. That being said, on his way to Damascus to have some more Christians arrested, Paul has an encounter that will forever change the direction of his life. A light shines from heaven. He hears the voice of Jesus Christ saying, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" To which he responds, "Who are you, Lord?" And he is led by the hand into the nearest town, blind. And for 3 days he is blind. He doesn't eat a thing. And finally a Christian, I think by the name of Ananias, responds to Paul and comes and prays with him. The scales fall from his eyes. He is converted, and soon thereafter he goes into the synagogues proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah. This is an amazing conversion, to say the least. And the curious thing about it is he had nothing to gain through this conversion. It's not like he knew he was going to gain fame, popularity, riches. In fact, he lost all that. You can read, even in some of his letters, he recounts this. I think in Philippians chapter 3, he talks about how I have counted all things loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus Christ my Lord. I've suffered the loss of all things that I may know him. And so there was nothing to gain for Paul by converting to the Christian faith. And as we look in, let's say, I think like some of his other early letters, for example, Galatians chapters 1 and 2, you can see some of his own recollections about what happened soon after his conversion. Acts kind of skims over this a little bit, but you get a little more details in Acts, in Galatians. For example, he talks about spending 3 years in Arabia after his conversion, which you don't hear about in Acts. But we do know he eventually does make it to Jerusalem, where he meets with Peter and some of the and James and some of the other apostles, and kind of gains their seal of approval. And from that point on, he works tirelessly. Now, early on, understandably, some of the Christians were hesitant to embrace Paul. They didn't. Is this some trick? What's going on here? You know, and so I think some scholars say it took really like about 10 years before Paul got his first official ministry position. Not to say he probably wasn't ministering. It just before he was really put into a position where the early church would deem him as a minister. And a man by the name of Barnabas, who we see in the first couple of chapters in the book of Acts, comes to Paul and asks him to come with him to Antioch, to a church that's growing there. A lot of Gentiles are being converted, and he wants somebody that has a deep knowledge of the Old Testament to come and to teach these new Christians. And so Paul is brought to Antioch. He and Barnabas soon thereafter are ordained to go and to spread this gospel of Jesus Christ throughout the Mediterranean world to the Gentile world at large. And they take their first of 3 of Paul's missionary journeys around what we know of today as Turkey or Asia Minor, Greece, and some of the islands in the Mediterranean. But it was Paul's ambition to eventually go to Rome. That was his life's goal. If I could get to Rome and I can proclaim the gospel there, he feels like he would have made it there. And he would eventually get there, but it would be a long time coming. And as we go through Paul's journeys and we see some of these churches, this is where these letters arise. These letters were not written in an organized way. When we look at, let's say, Galatians, 1st Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, look at all those letters. It's not like Paul sat down and he outlined all those letters and how they were supposed to be organized and different things like that. These letters were written out of necessity. They were written to put out fires in churches. They were written to address problems and issues. They were written to bring about some correction, to give some advice, to answer questions that people in those churches were asking, and also to provide some encouragement, to remind a lot of the people, hey, I, Paul, the one who was there teaching you, I'm thinking about you and I'm praying for you. Those are the kinds of things you see in some of those letters. Probably the most organized and systematic of those letters is probably Romans, because that's written to a group of people he's not seen yet. And so Paul's wanting to give a very detailed explanation of what the Christian faith is and what Christians believe. And so Romans is probably one of the most organized letters in the New Testament. Other than that, you got things like 1 Corinthians where Paul's writing to try to address an issue where some guy's sleeping with his stepmother or mother-in-law or something, and the people are getting drunk at the at the communion supper, and he's writing to say, look, we got to deal with some of these things. We can't live like everybody else, and that kind of stuff. He's dealing with false teachers like in Galatia, and people have come in behind him and starting to teach people, if you really want to be saved, you got to be circumcised. If you really want to follow Jesus Christ, you also need to follow the law of Moses, that kind of thing. So that's where those letters come from. And they're really important. Like I said, Paul wrote, probably 2/3 of the New Testament, and they're all, and it's all his letters. Now, some of those letters, they're personal in nature. Philemon, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, those are all written to individuals. Titus and 1st, 2nd Timothy is written to kind of encourage these young ministers to also help establish leadership in the early church and that kind of thing. And some of those letters are written while Paul's on the go. Some of them are written from prison. He gets arrested quite a bit. In fact, if you look in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, you can kind of get an idea of what Paul's ministry was like. Like I said, he really had nothing to gain by converting to Christianity. And oftentimes he was maligned, talked about in a very negative fashion. And people would come behind him and try to kind of undermine him. And he goes in 2 Corinthians where he defends himself. And it kind of gives us a little bit of insight into what his ministry is like. In chapter 11, I'll start with verse 23. It says, "Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prison more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. That means he was beaten. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among brethren. In peril and in weariness and in toil, in sleeplessness of night, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Beside these other things, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for the churches." And so that's kind of a brief snapshot of some of the things that Paul endured. Now, Paul would eventually make it to Rome. He would go to Rome, and historians tell us, and in church history and church tradition says that Paul likely died around 63, 64, 65 AD under the reign of Emperor Nero and was beheaded. But I think some of his final words, which are recorded in the book of 2 Timothy, are very telling about this man's heart and his desire, where he tells young Timothy, "I have fought the good fight. I have run the race, and I have finished my course. And there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness in heaven." And so that was his passion, his desire. And according to Paul, to die would be a great gain to him. And of course he would. So I hope this helps, give you a little bit of insight, give you a little bit of understanding of this man that wrote so much of the New Testament, which we're about to get into.